Last time I replaced the entire front suspension in the DeLorean. Now it's time for the rears. The goal here was just to put in the new KW coilovers and call it a day, but that didn't go quite as planned. First, some quick disassembly. Someone over-tightened the lug nuts on one wheel. I had to use a breaker bar to get them off. The rear already has coilovers that I put in 15 years ago. They're probably fine, but I have these shiny new KWs, so... My trusty brass hammer shifted the pivot bolt back far enough to try to take off the shock, but like the front suspension, I could not get the nuts off the top. I tried holding the shock with vice grips, but I couldn't hold it tightly enough to keep the shock from spinning while I tried to loosen the nut. So, back to power tools. The angle grinder was too big, but the Dremel would fit just fine. I cut a vertical slice out of the nut, which loosened it enough to be able to turn it with the wrench. It takes a bit longer to do it this way than cutting the whole thing off with the grinder, but it works. I guess the spring was under a little tension, but not fly off and kill you levels of tension. That, and I was holding the coilover with the vice grips in a way that constrained the spring's movement. The pivot bolt was in pretty tight, so I put the nut back on and switched to my trusty sledgehammer. The more it moved, the easier it got. The new KWs go in just like the stock shocks. No surprises here. This would be a simple swap if it wasn't so hard to get the old parts out. I put in a new pivot bolt while I was in here. The old one was probably fine, but I did hit it with a sledgehammer a bunch of times, so replacing it seemed like a good idea. It was a little harder to get the new one through the lower link arm than I expected, but I did finally get it seated through a combination of tapping, prying, and just turning it with a wrench. I didn't mention it when I did the front, but I made sure to load the suspension before torquing the pivot bolts. The neutral position of the suspension is when the tires are on the ground, and tightening it like this helps avoid extra strain on the bolt and bushings. I adjusted the ride height to about where I had it with the old coilover. I'll fine-tune it later. And that's it for the passenger side. The driver's side, that was less cooperative. The pivot bolt was firmly stuck in the carrier. With my cheater bar on a wrench, I could barely make it turn. But it did turn. This is important. If it was completely seized and didn't turn at all, I'd probably have to cut the bolt into pieces, remove the hub carrier, and press out the parts that were still stuck in the carrier and the link arm. But after a heavy dose of penetrant and enough blows with the sledge, it did start to move. Very, very slowly. Since I was replacing the bolt, I didn't bother to put the nut on first. By the time I got it halfway to the shock, I had mushroomed it out and it wouldn't fit through the hole anymore. I had to use an angle grinder to reshape it a bit. Once the bolt was flush, the shock was officially in the way. And once again, the top nut wouldn't come free, so I had to call in the Dremel. That's not quite what I was going for. I thought I might be able to release some tension on the bolt by jacking up the lower link arm a bit. That didn't last long. Not that it was helping anyway. There is some risk when using a hammer on the carrier like this. The carrier is cast aluminum and it can crack under the impact, even when you're hitting the bolt and not the carrier directly. I had this happen when I installed those old coilovers and had to replace the entire carrier. The one on the other side is new, in the sense that 15 years old is newer than 40. While hitting the bolt is bad, it would be worse if I hit the carrier. Twice. At this point, I thought that maybe the bolt was loose enough that I could use a brass hammer, but that was a bit optimistic. And it was still too tight to twist it out with a wrench. To get the bolt through the carrier, I had to add a punch, which was slightly concerning because if I missed now, I'd hit my fingers. I just have to be careful. Okay, screw that. We're trying something else. The old bolt from the other side looks like it'll be a pretty good punch. And it was, right up until I knocked the other bolt out of the lower link arm. Then everything shifted just enough that the bolts weren't lined up anymore. I bought these a while ago for something. One of these should work. At some point, I realized that once the bolt was past the link arm bushing, I could just move the link arm out of the way entirely. I have a new bolt that I'm drowning anti-seize in the hopes that the next time I have to get this out, it'll take less than 2 hours. Yeah, this took 2 hours. Almost forgot the washers and the link arm. That would have sucked. Getting the arm lined up was harder than I expected. I tried a few things, but what worked was running the original bolt through the other side. Because I'd tapered it with an angle grinder, it self-aligned into the hole in the carrier. Then I could just tap the new bolt in until it kicked the old bolt out. This coilover goes in just like the other side, although this time I thought to unscrew the perch before I started mounting it. It's just easier to slide onto the bolt when you don't have the spring fighting you. And that's it for the coilovers. But we're not done yet. You may have noticed a wee bit of rust on the driver's side trailing arm. I swear it didn't look this bad before I started hitting with a hammer. I mean, I'd like to think I would have noticed that. The amount of rust that fell off the arm was not insignificant. By the time I got the bolt out, there was a pretty big pile of trailing arm bits on my floor. I thought I'd checked this arm not too long ago, and it seemed fine at the time, but I was clearly wrong. There are large holes rusted through it. This whole thing is junk. The trailing arm keeps the entire rear suspension in line. If this were to fail while driving, well, I'm not exactly sure what would happen, but it wouldn't be good. I ordered a pair of new stainless steel arms from DeLorean Industries and got to work taking the old arms out. First is this brake line that runs through the arm. These lines don't have a separate coaxial nut, so trying to remove the nut turns the entire brake line. This means I had to disconnect the line at the caliper so that I could unscrew the whole thing as one piece. The other end has a nut that's supposed to fit in a hexagonal hole in the back of the flange so that it can't spin while you unscrew the nut on the other end. The problem is the hex was rusted out, and attempting to turn the other nut just twisted the brake line. I thought about removing the other end of the line so I could take the whole arm off and work on it on the bench, but that's up behind the transmission and it's gonna take more time to get that out than it's worth. Penetrant didn't work, holding the line with vice grips didn't work, and wedging a screwdriver against the hex end inside that cavity didn't work. So I gave up on all that and took a Dremel to it. There are 2 bolts that hold the trailing arm to the hub carrier. These were not a problem. I had to use a bolt as a punch again to tap them out, but they were easy. The other end is held on with the trailing arm bolt. There are stories of these bending under high loads and compromising the rear suspension, so it's good to check them while you're in there. The factory installed these bolts before mounting the transmission. Replacing them isn't hard with a manual transmission, but the automatic is bigger and in exactly the wrong place to get to the bolts. While I was getting one of my transmissions replaced, I had them swapped out with Toby tabs from DeLorean Parts Northwest. These are made from Inconel, which is a much stronger metal than the steel of the original bolts and much less likely to fail. Once I got the passenger arm off, I could see that it wasn't too bad. There were a few points where some patches needed to be welded in, but it was still serviceable. It is probably best that I'm replacing it though. I also have to keep track of these shims. They go between the trailing arm and the frame and are used to set the rear wheel toe in. So I need to put them all back the way I found them. The new trailing arms arrived a few days later. They are very, very nice. They are much sturdier than even the brand new stock arms. And they replaced the integrated hex thing for the brake line with a simple flange that is itself bolted on. So if you have to take the arm off, you can just unbolt the flange and avoid having to drain all the brake fluid. Mounting this arm wasn't much of a problem. It took a little bit to align it to the hub carrier so that the bolts would fit, but it wasn't too bad. The only real problem was finding a wrench for the head of the tab that also fit between the transmission and the frame. I bought a set of offset wrenches with just the right slope before I saw someone use a flex head socket to do the same thing. That would have been a lot easier. I already have one of those. On the driver's side, the brake line came off on the first try. I didn't have to resort to cutting or anything. Okay, a little tapping, but no cutting. The carrier nuts were a bit more of a challenge because they were rusted. Not enough that they wouldn't turn, but just enough of corrosion that I had to hammer a socket on. But they came off their bolts just fine. Actually getting the arm off the car, that was a bit harder. Man, look at all this rust. How did I not see this earlier? So the trick to get the arm off was to pry it all the way off the carrier, then pry it a bit more, then hammer it, a little more prying, some tapping, and then I could pull it off the tab. As far as I can tell, this arm is mostly made of rust now. This part is ready to fall off. The epoxy that was still there is brittle and flaking. There are large holes rusted straight through, and the flange around the hub carrier is about to snap right off. This couldn't be replaced soon enough. I am kind of amazed it didn't break off on its own already. As hard as it was to get the old arm out, it was even harder to get the new one in. For something with only 3 bolts, you'd think there wouldn't be much to it. The problem was the trailing arm bolt. I think the correct way to do this is to place the arm on the carrier, align it with the tab, and then push the tab through. But with the automatic transmission in the way, I can't push the tab back far enough to actually place the arm in the right location and mount it onto the carrier. So I kept trying different angles. What finally worked was sliding the arm onto the tab first, then prying it onto the carrier. Eventually. Okay, that actually worked. The brake lines were much easier to reinstall. I had to replace the nut that I'd cut off, but I couldn't find one that was quite as thin as the original. As long as it doesn't keep the brake line from seating completely, it'll be fine. Almost forgot the anti-seize. And it works. The gap here means that the brake line is fully seated. Now I just need to mount the calipers correctly, fill the brake system, bleed it, and I'm done. This suspension should last a long time. I'm hoping forever, but a couple of decades is probably more realistic, at least the way I drive. I have to fix my muffler again before I can take it for a test drive, but that's for the next video. So hit all the buttons so the algorithm can tell you when that's ready. Thanks for watching.